4. When we talk about setting boundaries, most people immediately think of them as restrictions, as if we're cutting people off or building fences around ourselves. But that's a shallow way of looking at it. In truth, boundaries are not about shutting someone out. They're about letting the right people in on the right terms. For a boundary is a declaration of self-respect. It says, this is who I am, this is what I value, and this is how I expect to be treated. And the moment you bring that energy into a relationship with an avoidant, everything begins to shift. C. 4. Avoidants are masters of control, not in the loud, aggressive way we sometimes imagine, but in subtle ways. They create distance. 4. They pull back when things get too close. They expect others to bend, to tolerate, to adjust, so they never have to confront the very fears they're running from. And as long as you go along with it, overgiving, explaining, justifying, shrinking yourself, they feel secure in their illusion of control. 4. But the moment you plant your feet and say, this is my standard, this is my limit, you shake that entire structure. You disrupt the very dynamic they depend on. This is why boundaries are powerful, because the avoidant doesn't actually want you to have them. They want you to compromise. 4. To carry both sides of the connection, to keep proving your worth so they can keep withholding theirs. And here's the paradox: when you refuse to play that role, when you respect yourself enough to hold firm, it unsettles them in a way few other things can. They may not show it on the surface. Remember, 4. Avoidants are skilled at looking indifferent, but inside it throws them into chaos. Suddenly, they're not in charge of the rhythm anymore. You are. Now, why does that matter? Because it forces them to face themselves. When you stop giving endless chances, when you stop rescuing them from their own discomfort, or the mirror turns back on them, your boundary says, I will not participate in your avoidance. And that's when the struggle begins. 4. They wrestle with the realization that their old strategy, distancing, deflecting, controlling, doesn't work on someone who knows their worth. 4. They can no longer keep the relationship on their terms. But here's the key. You're not doing it to punish them, or you're not drawing a line to prove a point or to control them back. You're doing it because self-respect demands it. Or you cannot build intimacy by betraying yourself. And when you understand that, you begin to see boundaries not as walls, but as doors. They're thresholds that say, 4, if you want to come closer, this is how it must be. If you can't respect that, then this is where it ends. That clarity is freedom for you and for whether they like it or not, for them too. Think about it, most people spend years in relationships where they abandon themselves for all to keep someone else comfortable. And yet, when you finally set a boundary, you step into a higher level of truth. For you're no longer begging someone to see your value, you're living it. And that changes everything. It changes the energy of the relationship. For it changes how they see you, and most importantly, it changes how you see yourself. The truth is, boundaries don't push the right people away. They reveal them. They separate those who can rise to meet you from those who can't. And yes, the avoidant will struggle because you're stripping away their old safety net. But that's not your burden to carry. Your only job is to stay grounded in your worth, to stand in that place of strength, and to let the chips fall where they may. Because in the end, the most powerful boundary you can set is the one that says, I will not betray myself to keep you. And when you live from that place, you stop chasing, you stop shrinking, and you start leading, not just the relationship, but your life. And that right there is the beginning of real freedom. Here's how we can expand key point 2 into a full 600-word segment that flows naturally with the previous one. What most people don't see when they're caught in the push and pull of an avoidant relationship is that the avoidant is not actually as independent as they appear. On the surface, they project strength, self-sufficiency, even indifference. They want you to believe they don't need anyone. That closeness is optional and distance is their natural state. But if you peel back that layer, you discover something they would never admit. Their entire strategy depends on your compliance. They need you to tolerate their distance. They need you to accept their inconsistency. They need you to keep reaching, to keep giving, to keep filling the silence with your effort, so they don't have to step up and risk vulnerability. That's the hidden dependence. It's not that they need your constant affection in the way an anxious partner might, but they rely just as much, if not more, on your willingness to play by their rules. They depend on your silence when they pull away. They depend on your explanations when they go cold. They depend on your self-doubt. Because if you're questioning your worth, 4, you'll be less likely to challenge them. 4, this dynamic gives them a sense of power and control without ever having to confront the deeper fears that drive their avoidance. 4, but here's where the shift happens. The moment you refuse to comply, the game changes. When you set a boundary and hold it, 4, when you stop over-functioning in the relationship, when you stop carrying the emotional load for two people, you rip away that hidden safety net, 4. And that's when the avoidant begins to struggle. Because suddenly, the very system they've relied on to maintain distance no longer works. You're no longer bending. You're no longer cushioning the impact of their choices. You're no longer protecting them from the discomfort of facing themselves. 4, this is where the ground shakes beneath them. They start to feel the loss of control. They may react with frustration. They may withdraw even more. 4, or they may try to test your boundary to see if you really mean it. But deep down, they know something has changed. Their hidden dependence is exposed. 4, and that's terrifying for someone who has built an entire identity around not needing anyone. Now, why is this important for you to understand? 4, because if you don't see the dynamic clearly, you'll mistake their struggle as a sign that you're doing something wrong. You'll think, 4, maybe I shouldn't have set that boundary. Maybe I'm being too harsh. Maybe I should soften to keep the peace. That's the trap. 4, that's the compliance they're counting on. But if you see the truth, that their discomfort is not about you rejecting them, but about them losing the control they once had, you'll have the strength to hold your ground. And here's the beauty of it, Ty. When you hold your ground, 4, you force them into a choice. They can either retreat further into their avoidance, or they can step forward into growth. Both outcomes give you clarity. 4, if they retreat, you see they were never willing to meet you at your level. If they step forward, it means your boundary gave them the wake-up call they needed. 4, either way you win, because you've stopped playing by their rules and started living by your own. Boundaries expose the imbalance. 4, they shine a light on the silent contract the avoidant was counting on. That you would always do the work so they never had to. And once that contract is broken, 4, once that hidden dependence is revealed, they are left with only two options: evolve or lose the relationship. And that's the power you hold. 4, not in controlling them, not in chasing them, but in refusing to comply with a dynamic that robs you of your worth. When you stop carrying what isn't yours, 4, you start living in alignment with who you are. Because at the end of the day, the greatest shift happens when you realize this. 4, their struggle is not your problem, it's their opportunity. Do you want me to expand key point 3 next in the same flow? 4, so the whole speech builds like a Tony Robbins style progression. Here's the expanded key point 3 in the same flow and style. 4, seamlessly continuing from the first 2. An avoidance real struggle doesn't begin with you. It begins inside themselves. When you introduce a boundary into the dynamic, you're not just telling them what you will or won't accept. You're holding up a mirror. And that mirror reflects back the very thing they've been running from all along: the tension between their fear of abandonment and their fear of closeness. 4, that internal tug of war is the core of the avoidant experience. They crave connection, but the moment it feels real, they pull back. They long to be loved. 4, but the moment love gets too close, it feels like suffocation. Your boundary shines a spotlight on that contradiction. When you stand your ground, 4, you strip away the middle ground they've been hiding in, the gray area where they can keep you close enough to feel secure, but far enough to avoid true intimacy. 4, suddenly they can't just coast. They're confronted with a choice to step forward into vulnerability or lose the connection altogether. 4, and that choice tears open the very conflict they've spent years trying to suppress. Here's the irony. Most avoidants believe they're protecting themselves from pain. They build walls, they create distance, they convince themselves they don't need anyone. 4, but the truth is, the pain they fear is already living inside them. It's the old wound of not feeling safe to love or be loved. It's the echo of rejection. 4, neglect or betrayal from their past. Boundaries don't create that pain, they reveal it. And when you stop cushioning them from reality, 4, they feel it more sharply than ever. That's why they struggle. Not because you're being unfair, 4, but because they're finally facing the emptiness that distance was supposed to protect them from. And that's when things get interesting. Because human beings, when faced with truth, can either rise or retreat. Some avoidants will double down on their defenses. They'll ghost, they'll lash out. 4, they'll try to convince themselves you were too demanding. But others, when they hit that wall, 4, will realize the pattern they've been running can't sustain them. Your boundary becomes the catalyst for growth. 4, it awakens the part of them that knows, deep down, that their avoidance has been costing them the very intimacy they secretly crave. Now understand this. 4, it's not your job to fix that conflict for them. Too many people fall into the trap of thinking, if I love them harder, if I wait longer, if I explain better, 4, maybe they'll see. But that only feeds the cycle. Their struggle is their work. Your role is to hold steady, to let your boundaries speak the truth. I will not abandon myself to accommodate your fear. That's not cruelty, that's integrity. Because here's the deeper truth when you hold firm. 4, you're not just teaching them how to treat you, you're teaching them what real intimacy requires. Intimacy demands courage. It demands presence. 4, it demands stepping into the unknown and risking being seen. Without that, there's no relationship, only a performance of one. 4, and your boundary exposes that difference. So yes, the avoidant will struggle when faced with your limits. They'll wrestle with the tension they've avoided for years. But that struggle is the very doorway to transformation. Some will walk through it, some will not. But either way, you've done your part. You've stopped colluding with their avoidance and started honoring your truth. 4, and that's the lesson they can't escape, that love without accountability isn't love at all. Here's the expanded key point 4 in the same style. 4, designed to close out the speech with power and clarity. The beauty of a boundary is that it doesn't just protect you. It reveals the truth of the relationship. Think of it as a test, not a punishment. A boundary says, if this connection is real, if this love is genuine, it will withstand clarity. It will survive honesty. 4, it will grow stronger when there are standards. And that's where the avoidant feels the most pressure, because suddenly, the unspoken agreement is broken. They can no longer drift in and out without consequence. They can no longer dictate the rhythm of closeness and distance. Your boundary puts the ball in their court. 4, and the way they respond tells you everything you need to know. When someone respects your boundary, even if they struggle with it, 4, it shows they value the connection enough to grow. That's a sign of possibility. It doesn't mean they'll become instantly secure. 4, it doesn't mean the work is over, but it does mean there's a willingness to lean in rather than pull away. That willingness is the seed of transformation. 4, and sometimes all it takes is that seed to begin changing the dynamic of an entire relationship. But if they resist, if they punish you for standing your ground, 4, if they call you selfish, demanding, or too much, what they're really telling you is that they are not ready to meet you at your level. 4, and while that may sting, it is also a gift, because it frees you from illusion. 4, it frees you from wasting years in a cycle where you're starving for love while convincing yourself that crumbs are enough. The clarity hurts, but it also heals. 4, because when someone shows you who they are in the face of your boundary, you no longer have to guess. That's the power of boundaries. They filter. 4, they sift out what is fragile from what is strong. They expose whether the bond is built on real intimacy or just convenience. And yes, for the avoidant, 4, that filter is uncomfortable because it demands something they've spent their life avoiding: accountability. But without accountability, 4, there is no partnership. There is only a one-sided performance where you carry the weight and they enjoy the comfort. And here's what I want you to hear. 4, you don't set a boundary to change the avoidant. You set a boundary to honor yourself. Whether they rise to the occasion or retreat into their fear is their choice. 4, but the moment you create that line in the sand, you reclaim your power. You stop waiting to be chosen and start choosing yourself. And in that choice, 4, you discover the deepest form of freedom. Not freedom from love, but freedom from begging for it. See, people often fear that boundaries will push others away. 4, but the truth is, boundaries only push away those unwilling to do the work of real connection. The right ones will lean in, the wrong ones will leave. And either way, 4, you win. Because the worst prison is not being alone, it's being in a relationship where you have to abandon yourself just to be tolerated. So yes, 4, the avoidant may struggle when faced with your boundaries. They may resist, they may wrestle, they may even run. But that struggle isn't your responsibility. 4, it's their mirror. And sometimes the greatest act of love, for them and for you, is allowing them to face that reflection without rescuing them from it. 4, because in the end, the most important boundary you can ever set is the one that says, I refuse to lose myself in order to keep you. And once you live from that place, everything changes.